Thomas Mitchell had always been a quiet man who kept to himself. At 62 years old, he lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Millfield, a growing town where new developments seemed to spring up overnight. His most valuable possession was a 10-acre plot of undeveloped land he had inherited from his father 20 years earlier. The land sat about 2 miles from his home, covered in old oak trees and wild grass, untouched by modern development. Thomas visited the property every few weeks, mainly to check for trespassers or dumped trash. The land held sentimental value beyond its monetary worth. His father had bought it in 1975 with dreams of building a small farm, but cancer had taken him before those dreams could be realized. Thomas had never felt ready to develop it himself, preferring to let it remain as his father had left it. On a crisp Tuesday morning in early March, Thomas drove his old pickup truck down the familiar dirt road that led to his property, but as he rounded the final bend, he stopped the truck so suddenly that gravel flew from under his tires. Where once there had been empty land and towering trees, he now saw the skeletal frame of what appeared to be a large house under construction. His heart pounded as he stepped out of the truck. Workers in hard hats moved around the construction site like ants, carrying materials and operating machinery. A concrete foundation had already been poured, and wooden framing reached toward the sky. Someone had not only trespassed on his land, but had begun building an entire house without his permission. Thomas approached the construction site, his hands shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. A young foreman noticed him walking toward the work area and came over to meet him. "Sir, this is a construction zone," the foreman said politely but firmly. "For your safety, I'll need to ask you to stay back." "This is my land," Thomas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The foreman looked confused. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "This is my property," Thomas repeated louder this time. "I own this land." The foreman's expression changed from confusion to concern. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Within minutes, a well-dressed man in an expensive suit arrived at the scene. The man introduced himself as Robert Carlson, the project developer. "There seems to be some misunderstanding," Carlson said with a confident smile. "We have all the proper permits and documentation for this build. The land was purchased through proper channels 6 months ago." Thomas felt his world spinning. "That's impossible. I never sold this land to anyone." Carlson pulled out a folder from his car and showed Thomas several official-looking documents. The papers showed a sale transaction for the exact plot of land where they stood. The seller was listed as Thomas Mitchell, and the signature looked remarkably similar to his own. "As you can see," Carlson continued, "everything is in order. Perhaps you're mistaken about the boundaries of your property." Thomas stared at the documents, his mind racing. The signature wasn't his, but it was close enough that he could understand how someone might be fooled. Someone had forged his signature and illegally sold his land. But who? And how had they managed to create such convincing paperwork? "I'm telling you, I never signed these papers," Thomas insisted. "Someone has stolen my land." Carlson's friendly demeanor began to fade. "Sir, I understand this might be upsetting, but we have invested considerable money into this project based on legitimate documentation. If you have concerns about the sale, I suggest you contact your lawyer." Thomas realized he was fighting a losing battle at the construction site. He needed to gather his own documentation and figure out how this had happened. He returned to his truck, his mind filled with questions and growing anger. Back at his house, Thomas searched through his filing cabinet until he found the original deed to the property. The document clearly showed that he was the rightful owner, and there was no record of any sale. He also found his father's will, which explicitly left the land to Thomas. The next morning, Thomas called the county clerk's office to report the fraudulent sale. The clerk, a helpful woman named Martha, listened to his story with growing concern. "Mr. Mitchell, this is a serious matter," Martha said. "If someone has indeed forged your signature to sell your property, that's a felony. You'll need to file a police report immediately." Thomas spent the rest of the day at the police station, filing reports and providing documentation. Detective Sarah Rodriguez was assigned to his case. She explained that property fraud was becoming more common, especially in areas with rapid development. "The problem is," Detective Rodriguez explained, "even if we can prove fraud, it doesn't automatically stop the construction. The buyers may have acted in good faith, believing they were purchasing legitimate property. This could take months or even years to resolve through the courts. Thomas left the police station feeling defeated. By the time the legal system sorted out the mess, the house would be completed and sold to an innocent family. The developer would likely claim they were also victims of the fraud, having invested money based on what appeared to be legitimate documents. That evening, Thomas sat on his porch thinking about his options. He could hire an expensive lawyer and fight a lengthy court battle with no guarantee of success. He could try to get an injunction to stop construction, but that would also require legal proceedings. Or he could do something else entirely. As he sat there, an idea began to form in his mind. It was risky, and it would require patience, but it might be the only way to get real justice. Instead of trying to stop the construction, what if he let them finish? What if he waited until they had invested everything into the project and then proved his ownership? The more Thomas thought about it, the more the plan appealed to him. Let them build their house on his land. Let them pour more money into the foundation, the framing, the roof, the plumbing, and the electrical work. Let them create something valuable on property they didn't actually own. Then when the house was complete and they were ready to sell it, he would present the real deed and show the world who the actual owner was. The shock on their faces would be worth all the stress and anger he was feeling now. Thomas smiled for the first time since discovering the construction. They thought they had outsmarted him, but he would show them what patience and determination could accomplish. He would let them dig their own grave, one nail and board at a time. Over the following weeks, Thomas developed a routine that would have seemed strange to anyone watching. Every morning, he would drive to a small hill about a quarter-mile from his property, park his truck behind a cluster of trees, and watch the construction progress through a pair of old binoculars his father had used for bird watching. The construction crew worked with impressive efficiency. Thomas watched as they erected walls, installed windows, and began work on the roof. The house was clearly going to be large and expensive, much bigger than anything Thomas could have afforded to build himself. It was a 2-story colonial style with a 3-car garage, bay windows, and what appeared to be plans for a deck overlooking the back portion of the property. During his surveillance, Thomas began to recognize the individual workers. There was Miguel, the young carpenter who always arrived first and left last. There was Frank, the older electrician who seemed to supervise much of the technical work. And there was Joey, the plumber who had a habit of singing while he worked. These men were just doing their jobs, Thomas realized. They had no idea they were building on stolen land. The thought made Thomas feel somewhat guilty about his plan, but he reminded himself that the real criminals were Robert Carlson and whoever had forged his signature. The workers would get paid regardless of what happened to the house once it was finished. Thomas also used this time to conduct his own investigation. He spent hours at the county courthouse, researching property records and trying to understand how the fraudulent sale had been processed. What he discovered made his blood boil. The forged documents hadn't just appeared overnight. Someone had created an elaborate paper trail spanning several months. There were fake property assessments, false utility transfers, and even fraudulent tax payments. Whoever had orchestrated this theft had been planning it for a long time and had significant knowledge of how property transactions worked. Martha from the county clerk's office became Thomas's unofficial ally in his research. She helped him navigate the complex filing systems and pointed out irregularities in the documentation that a casual observer might miss. "Look at this signature on the utility transfer," Martha said during one of Thomas's visits. "See how the T in Thomas is formed differently than in the deed signature? And the notary stamp here uses a seal that was reported stolen from a notary office in the next county 3 months before this transaction." The evidence was mounting, but Detective Rodriguez explained that gathering evidence and proving it in court were 2 different things. The investigation was ongoing, but these cases moved slowly through the legal system. Meanwhile, the house continued to grow. Thomas watched as they installed a beautiful stone fireplace, hardwood floors, and granite countertops in the kitchen. The exterior was being finished with expensive brick and decorative stonework. He estimated that the construction costs alone were approaching $300,000. One afternoon, while Thomas was in his usual observation spot, a black luxury sedan pulled up to the construction site. Robert Carlson stepped out along with a woman Thomas hadn't seen before. She was elegantly dressed and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to wealth. They walked around the property, pointing at various features and discussing what appeared to be final details. Thomas adjusted his binoculars and watched as the woman pulled out her phone and began taking pictures. She seemed excited about something, smiling and gesturing enthusiastically. Carlson was clearly trying to impress her, probably a potential buyer who was already interested in purchasing the completed house. The realization hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. They weren't just building a house on his land. They were actively marketing it for sale. The theft wasn't just about the land itself, but about the profit they expected to make from selling the finished property. That evening, Thomas called Detective Rodriguez to report what he had observed. She confirmed his suspicions. "We've discovered that Carlson's company has already listed the property for sale," she said. "The asking price is $650,000. They're planning to close on the sale within 30 days of construction completion." The numbers made Thomas's head spin. His 10-acre plot had been assessed at about $40,000 as undeveloped land. But with a house on it, especially a house of this quality, the property value had increased more than 15 times. The thieves weren't just stealing his land. They were stealing more than $500,000 in potential wealth. Thomas's anger grew, but so did his determination to see his plan through. Let them finish their expensive house. Let them find a buyer and get close to closing the sale. The bigger the investment, the more devastating it would be when he revealed the truth. Detective Rodriguez had warned him that even when they proved the fraud, the legal resolution might not be what he hoped for. The buyers might sue everyone involved, including Thomas, even though he was the victim. The construction company might claim they were owed money for their work. The whole situation could end up in court for years while lawyers got rich and everyone else suffered. But Thomas's plan would deliver immediate justice. When he walked onto that property with the real deed and proof of ownership, there would be no lengthy court battles or legal technicalities. The truth would be undeniable and the shock would be immediate. Thomas began preparing for the moment of revelation. He had the original deed photographed and certified by the county clerk. He obtained affidavits from neighbors who could testify that he had owned the land for decades. He even tracked down the lawyer who had handled his father's estate, getting sworn statements about the inheritance. He also began documenting the construction progress with his own photographs. Every day he took pictures showing the advancing work, creating a visual record of how much money and effort was being invested in his property. When the time came to confront the thieves, he wanted them to see exactly how much they stood to lose. As autumn approached, the house neared completion. The landscaping was being installed, with expensive shrubs and decorative trees planted around the foundation. A paved driveway had been laid, and outdoor lighting had been installed along the walkways. Thomas watched workers installing the final touches. Mailbox, house numbers, and a for sale sign that made his jaw clench every time he saw it. The sign featured a large photo of the completed house and contact information for Carlson's real estate company. The end of construction was approaching, and with it the moment Thomas had been planning for months. Soon, he would step out of the shadows and deliver the surprise of Carlson's lifetime. The patient observer was almost ready to become the rightful owner once again. While Thomas waited for construction to complete, his investigation into the fraud began revealing shocking details that went far beyond a simple property theft. What had started as anger over stolen land was evolving into something much more complex and disturbing. Detective Rodriguez called Thomas one rainy October morning with news that made his coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. The investigation had uncovered evidence that this wasn't an isolated incident. Robert Carlson's development company appeared to be running a sophisticated operation targeting elderly landowners across 3 counties. We've identified at least 12 other cases with similar patterns, Detective Rodriguez explained during their meeting at the police station. Elderly property owners forged signatures, fraudulent sales, and rapid development. In most cases, the victims didn't discover the theft until construction was already underway or completed. Thomas felt sick to his stomach. How many people have they stolen from? We're still investigating, but the preliminary estimate is that they've illegally acquired over 200 acres of land worth approximately $4 million at current market values. Your case just happened to be the one where someone noticed the theft early enough to do something about it. The detective spread a map across her desk, marked with red pins indicating suspected fraud locations. The pins formed a pattern radiating outward from the county seat, targeting rural properties that were ripe for development, but owned by people who might not check on them regularly. The sophisticated part is how they choose their targets, Rodriguez continued. They research property records to find elderly owners, particularly those living alone or in nursing homes. They study the properties to identify ones with development potential. Then they create false paperwork and sell the land to accomplices who immediately begin construction. Thomas stared at the map, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the criminal enterprise. What happened to the other victims? That's the tragic part. Most of them never got their land back. By the time they discovered the theft, houses had been built and sold to innocent buyers. The legal battles dragged on for years, and many of the elderly victims died before seeing any resolution. Even when they won in court, the monetary settlements rarely compensated for the full value of what was stolen. The detective's words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He thought about his father, who had worked 2 jobs to save enough money to buy that land. He thought about all the dreams and plans that property represented, not just for his family, but for the other victims who had been robbed of their legacies. "There's something else," Rodriguez said, lowering her voice. "We believe someone inside the county clerk's office is helping them." The level of access to property records and the sophistication of the forged documents suggests inside knowledge of how the system works. Thomas thought immediately of Martha, the helpful clerk who had been assisting with his research. Could she be involved? The thought made him feel paranoid and confused about who he could trust. "We're conducting an internal investigation," Rodriguez continued. "But we have to be careful not to tip off whoever might be involved. That's why I'm asking you to keep this information confidential for now." As if the situation wasn't complicated enough, Thomas received an unexpected phone call that afternoon. The caller identified himself as William Chen, a lawyer representing 3 families who had been victims of similar property frauds. "Mr. Mitchell, I've been following your case through law enforcement contacts," Chen said. "I'm putting together a class action lawsuit against Carlson's company and everyone involved in these property thefts. Would you be interested in joining our legal action?" Thomas was intrigued but cautious. "What would that involve?" "Instead of fighting individual battles, we pool our resources and evidence to take on the entire criminal organization. We're seeking not just return of stolen property, but punitive damages for the emotional distress and financial losses. We're also pushing for criminal charges against everyone involved." The lawyer explained that the class action approach had several advantages. It would be less expensive for each victim. It would generate more media attention, and it would put pressure on prosecutors to treat this as the organized crime operation it appeared to be. The downside, Chen admitted, is that legal action could take several years and there's no guarantee of success. These people have covered their tracks well, and they have expensive lawyers of their own. Thomas thanked Chen for the information but said he needed time to consider his options. The truth was he was still committed to his original plan of letting them finish construction before revealing his ownership. But the lawyer's call made him realize that his personal situation was part of a much larger pattern of crime. That evening, Thomas drove to his observation point one more time. The house was nearly complete now, with only finishing touches remaining. Lights were on inside, and he could see workers installing fixtures and doing final paintwork. The property looked beautiful, like something from a magazine cover. But now, looking at it, Thomas felt a mixture of emotions he hadn't expected. Yes, he was still angry about the theft. Yes, he was still determined to reclaim his property. But he also felt a strange sense of responsibility for the other victims, who hadn't been as fortunate as he was. Most of the other elderly victims hadn't discovered the theft until it was too late. They hadn't had the opportunity to gather evidence or plan a response. Many of them had probably felt helpless and defeated, watching helplessly as criminals profited from their stolen land. Thomas realized that his situation was unique in a way that gave him power. He had discovered the theft early. He had documented everything. He had legal proof of ownership that couldn't be disputed. And most importantly, he had the element of surprise. When he finally revealed his ownership and confronted the thieves, it wouldn't just be about getting his own land back. It would be about exposing their entire operation and potentially helping other victims get justice as well. The next morning, Thomas made 2 important phone calls. First, he called Detective Rodriguez and volunteered to work with law enforcement as they built their case against the criminal organization. He offered to wear a recording device when he eventually confronted Carlson, potentially capturing admissions that could be used in court. Second, he called lawyer William Chen and agreed to join the class action lawsuit, but with one condition. He wanted to time his revelation to maximize the impact on the criminal organization and the media attention for all the victims. "I want to wait until they think they've won," Thomas explained to Chen. "Let them get a buyer lined up, let them get close to closing the sale, let them think they're about to collect their biggest payday yet. Then we drop the hammer on all of them at once." Chen was intrigued by the strategy. "It's risky, but it could be devastating to their operation if we time it right. The media impact alone could help pressure prosecutors to take stronger action." Thomas hung up the phone feeling more determined than ever. He wasn't just fighting for his own land anymore. He was fighting for his father's memory, for all the other victims who had been robbed, and for the principle that criminals shouldn't profit from stealing from hardworking people. The house was almost finished, and his moment of revelation was approaching, but now Thomas understood that what happened next would be about much more than just getting his property back. It would be about justice on a scale much larger than he had originally imagined. The completion of the house in early November brought a flurry of activity that Thomas watched with growing anticipation and anxiety. Professional photographers arrived to take pictures for the real estate listing. A staging company delivered furniture to make the empty rooms look lived in and appealing. Even a landscaping crew came to add final touches to the yard, planting colorful flowers and installing decorative lighting. Thomas had to admit, despite his anger, that the house looked absolutely stunning. The thieves had spared no expense in creating a property that would appeal to wealthy buyers. Every detail, from the custom crown molding to the granite countertops, spoke of quality and luxury. The for sale sign in the front yard now displayed a bright red under contract banner, indicating that someone had already agreed to buy the property. Thomas's heart rate increased every time he saw it. The thieves were moving quickly to complete their scheme and collect their profit. Detective Rodriguez called with an update that made the situation even more urgent. "We've identified the buyers," she said. "It's a young couple with 2 small children. The husband is a doctor and the wife is a teacher. They've been saving for 5 years to buy their dream house, and they believe they found it on your property." The news hit Thomas harder than he had expected. Throughout his months of planning, he had thought of the buyers as abstract figures, merely part of the criminal's scheme. Now he learned they were real people with children, probably innocent victims themselves who would be devastated when the truth came out. "They're scheduled to close on the sale in 10 days, Rodriguez continued. "Once that happens, the legal situation becomes much more complicated. The buyers will have legal rights even though the sale is based on fraud, and sorting it out could take years in court." Thomas felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. If he waited much longer, innocent people would lose their life savings along with their dream home. But if he acted too soon, he might not have maximum impact on the criminal organization. "There's something else you should know," the detective added. "We've learned that Carlson's company is planning to close their local office and move operations to another state immediately after this sale. If we don't stop them now, they'll disappear and continue their fraud somewhere else." That evening, Thomas made a decision. He would reveal his ownership in 3 days, just before the scheduled closing, but after the buyers had invested emotionally and financially in the property. It would be devastating for everyone involved, but it was the only way to expose the truth before the criminals escaped. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Thomas arrived at his observation point to find the young couple who were buying the house walking around the property with their 2 children. The man was pointing out features of the house while the woman took pictures. The children, a boy and girl who appeared to be around 8 and 10 years old, were running around the yard, laughing and playing. Through his binoculars, Thomas could see the joy and excitement on their faces. The woman kept taking pictures of the children in front of the house, clearly planning to document their family's new beginning. The man was measuring spaces, probably planning where furniture would go. Thomas felt sick watching them. These people had no idea they were about to have their dreams shattered. They had probably already given notice on their current home, enrolled their children in new schools, and made countless plans based on the belief that this house would soon be theirs. But as he watched them, Thomas's resolve actually strengthened rather than weakened. These innocent people were about to become victims of the same criminals who had already robbed so many others. If he didn't act now, they would lose their money and still not get the house because eventually the fraud would be discovered. At least if he revealed the truth now, they might be able to recover their down payment and avoid losing everything. That afternoon, Thomas received a call from William Chen, the lawyer handling the class action lawsuit. "I've got news that changes everything," Chen said. "We've discovered that Robert Carlson's company doesn't actually exist as a legitimate business entity. It's basically a shell company created specifically for this fraud operation." The lawyer explained that deeper investigation had revealed that Carlson wasn't even the man's real name. His actual identity was Michael Harrison, and he had previous convictions for real estate fraud in 2 other states. The sophisticated operation was actually run by a network of criminals who moved from state to state, stealing property and disappearing before law enforcement could catch up. "This makes your evidence even more crucial," Chen continued. "You may be the only victim who can prove ownership clearly enough to stop them before they escape. Every day we wait, more innocent people become victims." Thomas made his final preparations that night. He gathered all his documentation into a folder, including the original deed, his father's will, the county clerk's certifications, and photographs documenting the entire construction process. He also prepared a written statement explaining exactly what had happened and why he had waited to reveal the truth. Detective Rodriguez agreed to accompany him when he confronted the criminals, both for his safety and to ensure that any evidence gathered would be admissible in court. They planned to arrive at the property the next morning when the buyers were scheduled for their final walkthrough before closing. Thomas hardly slept that night. He kept thinking about all the people who would be affected by what he was about to do. The innocent buyers who would lose their dream home. The construction workers who had done honest work on stolen land. Even Robert Carlson, or whatever his real name was, who was about to see his elaborate scheme exposed. But mostly, Thomas thought about his father. The old man had worked so hard to buy that land, dreaming of the farm he would build there someday. He had died before achieving that dream, but he had passed the land to Thomas, trusting him to protect it and honor the investment he had made. Tomorrow, Thomas would finally keep that promise. He would reclaim his father's land and expose the criminals who had tried to steal it. The moment he had been planning for months was finally at hand. As dawn broke, Thomas dressed carefully and gathered his documentation. He wanted to look dignified and authoritative when he revealed the truth. This wasn't just about anger or revenge anymore. It was about justice, truth, and protecting innocent people from criminals who thought they were too clever to be caught. Detective Rodriguez met him at the property entrance, along with 2 backup officers who would remain out of sight unless needed. The plan was simple. Wait for the buyers to arrive for their walkthrough, then calmly approach and explain the situation to everyone at once. Thomas checked his watch. In less than an hour, he would step out of the shadows and reclaim what was rightfully his. The long wait was almost over. The morning air was crisp and clear as Thomas waited in his truck, with Detective Rodriguez parked discreetly nearby. At exactly 9 o'clock, a white SUV pulled into the driveway of the house built on his stolen land. Thomas watched through his binoculars as the same family he had observed before stepped out of the vehicle. Dr. James Patterson, his wife Sarah, and their 2 children approached the front door with obvious excitement. Sarah carried a folder that probably contained their loan documents and closing paperwork. The children ran ahead, already claiming ownership of the property in their minds. 5 minutes later, Robert Carlson's black sedan arrived. The man Thomas now knew was actually Michael Harrison, stepped out wearing his usual expensive suit and confident smile. He greeted the Patterson family warmly, like an old friend helping them achieve their dreams. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his folder of documents. Months of planning and waiting had led to this moment. Everything would change in the next few minutes. Detective Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio she had given Thomas. "Are you ready? Remember, stay calm and let me handle any confrontation. Your job is just to present the documentation." Thomas took a deep breath and stepped out of his truck. He walked slowly toward the house, trying to project calm authority, despite the adrenaline rushing through his system. As he approached the front door, he could hear voices inside as Carlson gave the family a final tour of what they believed would be their new home. Thomas knocked firmly on the door. The voices inside stopped and footsteps approached. Dr. Patterson opened the door with a puzzled expression. "Can I help you?" Patterson asked politely. "Yes, you can," Thomas replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I'm the owner of this property." Patterson's confusion deepened. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. We're purchasing this house from Mr. Carlson's development company." "No mistake," Thomas said, opening his folder. "But there has been a crime. May I come in?" By now, the conversation had attracted everyone's attention. Sarah Patterson appeared behind her husband, and Carlson pushed forward with an expression that had shifted from confidence to concern. "What's going on here?" Carlson demanded. "Dr. Patterson, this man is obviously confused or disturbed. Perhaps we should call security." Thomas looked directly at Carlson for the first time since discovering the theft. "Hello, Michael Harrison. Or do you prefer Robert Carlson? I'm Thomas Mitchell, the actual owner of this land." The use of his real name hit Carlson like a physical blow. His face went pale, and Thomas could see him calculating options for escape or denial. "I don't know what you're talking about," Carlson said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Thomas handed Dr. Patterson the original deed to the property. "This document shows that I inherited this land from my father 20 years ago. I never sold it to anyone. Someone forged my signature and stole my property." Dr. Patterson examined the deed with growing alarm. As an educated professional, he could see that the document appeared legitimate and official. Sarah Patterson moved closer to read over her husband's shoulder. "This can't be right," Sarah whispered. "We've been planning this purchase for months. We've already sold our old house." Thomas felt genuine sympathy for the family's distress, but he continued his revelation. "6 months ago, someone used forged documents to illegally sell my land to Mr. Carlson's company. I discovered the theft when construction began, but I waited until now to reveal the truth because I wanted to understand the full scope of the criminal operation." Detective Rodriguez appeared at the door, displaying her badge. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Detective Rodriguez with the County Sheriff's Department. Mr. Mitchell is telling the truth. We've been investigating this property fraud for several months." Carlson made a sudden move toward the back door, but Detective Rodriguez was ready. "Mr. Harrison, please remain where you are. We have officers positioned around the property." The man who had called himself Robert Carlson stopped and turned back toward the group. His polished facade was cracking, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. "You don't understand," Carlson said to the Patterson family. "We made significant investments in this property. The construction costs alone exceeded $300,000. You can't just take that away from us." "You made those investments on stolen land," Thomas replied firmly. "Every dollar you spent was spent on property you didn't own and had no right to develop." Dr. Patterson was studying the deed more carefully now, comparing it to his own purchase documents. "The signatures are different," he said slowly. "The signature on our sale contract doesn't match the signature on this deed." Thomas handed him copies of the forged documents that Detective Rodriguez had obtained from the county clerk's office. "Your signature analysis is correct. Someone forged my signature to create a false sale, then sold the property to your family based on those forged documents." Sarah Patterson sank into one of the stage chairs, the reality of their situation hitting her. "We put down $50,000. We sold our house. The children are already enrolled in new schools." The weight of the innocent family's suffering made Thomas's chest tight with emotion. This was the part of his plan he had dreaded most, but it was necessary to expose the truth. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand this is devastating," Thomas said gently, "but if I hadn't revealed this now, you would have lost much more. Eventually, the fraud would have been discovered, and you would have lost your entire investment with no way to recover it." Detective Rodriguez stepped forward with handcuffs. "Michael Harrison, you're under arrest for real estate fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Carlson's composure finally cracked completely. "This is insane. You can't just destroy a legitimate business transaction because of some old paperwork." "The paperwork isn't old," Thomas said. "It's the original deed that proves I've owned this land for 20 years. Your paperwork is forged, and you know it." The detective began reading Carlson his rights while calling for the backup officers to take him into custody. The Patterson family stood in stunned silence, trying to process how their dream home had become a nightmare in the span of 15 minutes. Dr. Patterson handed the deed back to Thomas. "Sir, I can see that you're the rightful owner. But what happens now? We've invested our life savings in this property. Thomas had been dreading this question, but he had also been preparing for it. Dr. Patterson, I want you to know that Detective Rodriguez and the District Attorney's Office are working to help victims like your family recover your losses. The criminals will be prosecuted and there will be efforts to recover and return the money they stole. But what about the house? Sarah Patterson asked, looking around at the beautiful home they had believed would be theirs. Thomas looked around the house that had been built on his stolen land. For months he had focused on the satisfaction of exposing the thieves and reclaiming his property, but now, seeing the devastation on this innocent family's faces, he realized that victory felt more complicated than he had expected. The children, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation they didn't fully understand, began to cry as they realized their new home was being taken away. Thomas knelt down to their level. I know this is scary and confusing, but sometimes adults do bad things and other adults have to fix them. Your parents didn't do anything wrong and neither did you. As the police led Carlson away, Thomas stood in the doorway of the house built on his land, surrounded by the devastation caused by the criminals' greed. The moment of revelation he had planned for so long was complete, but the real work of seeking justice was just beginning. In the weeks following Michael Harrison's arrest, Thomas found himself at the center of a media storm that spread far beyond the borders of Millfield. The story of the patient landowner who waited for thieves to finish building before revealing his ownership captured national attention, turning Thomas from a quiet retiree into an unlikely symbol of justice and determination. The first major breakthrough came when Harrison, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of federal charges, agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. His confession opened the floodgates on the entire criminal operation. Detective Rodriguez called Thomas with updates that seemed to come daily. Harrison has given us names, locations, and details about property frauds in 7 states, she reported. The FBI is now involved because the operation crossed state lines. We're looking at over 50 victims and approximately $12 million in stolen property. The investigation revealed that Harrison's network had been operating for nearly 5 years, specifically targeting elderly rural landowners whose property had development potential. They had bribed county officials, corrupted notary services, and created an entire infrastructure designed to steal land and convert it into cash as quickly as possible. Martha, the county clerk who had helped Thomas with his research, was cleared of any wrongdoing. The real conspirator was her supervisor, who had access to property records and the authority to fast-track fraudulent paperwork. The man was arrested trying to flee to Mexico with over $200,000 in cash. For Thomas, the media attention was both rewarding and overwhelming. Reporters wanted to interview him, lawyers wanted to represent him, and victims of similar crimes wanted his advice. But his primary concern remained the Patterson family, whose lives had been disrupted by his revelation. The legal resolution for the Pattersons came sooner than anyone expected. The district attorney's office, under pressure from media coverage and public outcry, moved aggressively to recover stolen funds from Harrison's network. Within 6 weeks, the Pattersons received a full refund of their down payment, plus additional compensation for their moving expenses and temporary housing costs. But the question of the house itself remained complicated. Thomas owned the land, but Harrison's company had invested significant money in construction using funds obtained through fraud. Legal experts debated who had claims to the structure and how to resolve the competing interests. Thomas surprised everyone, including himself, with his solution. During a meeting with the Pattersons, their lawyer, and Detective Rodriguez, he made an announcement that no one saw coming. I've been thinking about this situation for weeks, Thomas said. The Pattersons are innocent victims who fell in love with this house. They've been through enough trauma already. I want to sell them the property at a fair price that covers my costs and gives them the home they wanted. Dr. Patterson looked stunned. Mr. Mitchell, that's incredibly generous, but the house was built with stolen money. You don't owe us anything. Maybe not legally, Thomas replied, but morally I think I do. Your family shouldn't suffer more because of crimes committed by other people. The house is beautiful, and your children have already been through enough disappointment. The arrangement Thomas proposed was elegant in its simplicity. The Pattersons would purchase the land at its assessed value of $40,000. The house built with stolen funds that were being recovered through asset forfeiture. would be sold to them at cost price through a special program for fraud victims. Sarah Patterson started crying when she understood what Thomas was offering. Why would you do this for strangers? Thomas thought about his answer carefully. Because this whole experience taught me something I didn't expect. I spent months being angry about what was stolen from me, but I ended up learning more about what I could give to others. My father bought this land with dreams of building something meaningful here. Maybe helping your family build their dreams is what he would have wanted. The legal paperwork took another month to complete. But by Christmas, the Patterson family was living in the house that had been built on Thomas's land. Thomas attended their housewarming party, bringing a gift that surprised everyone: the original deed to the property, framed and signed with a note that read, "From the previous owner to the rightful owners." The criminal network's trial began the following spring. Thomas testified about his experience, but by then, the media attention had moved on to other stories. Harrison received 8 years in federal prison, and his accomplices received varying sentences based on their level of involvement. The corrupt county official received 12 years and was ordered to pay full restitution to all victims. The class action lawsuit that William Chen had organized resulted in a settlement that compensated most of the fraud victims, though many elderly landowners had died before seeing justice. Thomas donated his portion of the settlement to a legal aid fund that helps elderly property owners protect themselves from similar frauds. 1 year after discovering the theft, Thomas stood in the backyard of what was now the Patterson family's home, watching their children play on a swing set that Dr. Patterson had installed near the old oak trees. The same trees that Thomas's father had loved were now shading a new generation of dreamers. "Do you ever regret not keeping the house for yourself?" Sarah Patterson asked, joining Thomas on the deck that overlooked his former property. Thomas considered the question while watching the children laugh and play. "I thought I wanted justice, which I imagined would be getting back what was stolen from me. But I learned that sometimes justice means making sure the right thing happens, even if it's not what you originally planned." The house had indeed been built on his land without permission, and he had waited until the thieves finished before dropping the deed. But the true victory wasn't in reclaiming his property or seeing the criminals punished. It was in ensuring that innocent people weren't destroyed by other people's crimes, and that something beautiful could grow from something that had started with theft and deception. As Thomas drove home that evening, he passed the sign at the front of the property that now read "The Patterson Family" instead of "For Sale." He smiled, knowing that his father would have approved of how the land was finally being used. Dreams had been planted there after all, just not the ones anyone had originally expected. The patient landowner had gotten his justice, but more importantly, he had learned that true victory sometimes means giving others the chance to build their own dreams on the foundation of your sacrifice. The house built without permission had become a home built with purpose, and that made all the waiting worthwhile.